Um, all right. Well, I am going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite arguments against the Genesis flood. First, I'll go over some random stuff, and I'll go over what the Genesis flood is, what it talks about, and some of its predictions, and then I'll explain why this is my favorite argument against the Genesis flood for an old Earth. Before I do that, though, I'm going to post a link because, yeah, if you want to come in and talk to me or talk about stuff, definitely. Um, I'm a little over the flat Earth discussions, so if you come in and it ends up just going to that, I'll be a jerk and kick you. But I mean, no one ever comes into these anyway, so that's not going to be a problem. So let me just post this link. Posting the link so that people can come in. Let me see if it actually worked out. Posted the link. Yeah. Okay, cool. I should also mention that right now my profile picture, you'll see, I'll show it to you. Right now, this is, I believe it's called a Nerikabe. It's a Japanese folk spirit. And I learned about them through a Reddit thread, a Reddit Today I Learned thread, where someone said, today I learned of this thing, which forms in the shape of a passage that people want to go through and blocks people from going through those passage. And I thought that was quite silly. And if you see the full picture, you'll see that this guy is in the shape of like a brick, blocking two women from getting from point A to point B. And so it looks really cool too. So that's why it's my profile picture. All right. The other thing, what else? Oh yeah, for just in case I actually do become a productive member of society and get a respectable job, I decided to change to leave out my last name and go with Sunseed after my favorite Christian band. So it's not my real last name. And I thought, hey, people, the thing to do if you were in the Ramones was to act like your last name was Ramone. And I thought it would be funny if people who are in the band Sunseed, who spawned the classic Jesus is a Friend of Mine, I thought it'd be funny if they all acted as if they had a last name. And that last name was their band name, Sunseed. It's not that funny. But anyways, that's the name change if it ever shows up. Anything else? Okay. So the Genesis flood is the Noah's Ark account in the Old Testament of the Judeo-Christian Bible. And this flood is proposed by young Earth creationists, people who think the Earth is 6,000 years old. They say that the flood event is responsible for all of the sedimentary layers that we see today in the geologic column. Different young Earth creationists will vary. Some say that it's above the Precambrian up until the, oh gosh, I want to say Cenozoic, but some even go like even more specific. The Cenozoic was around like 250 million years ago. That's when it started, I believe. It goes up to that from the Cambrian, which the Cambrian is 540 542 million years ago to roughly, oh, I already forgot what I said. Anyways, a long time ago, like a lot of geologic time is condensed into the single flood event that's described in Genesis, which is described as happening roughly 1400 years after God created the earth. And the flood event is said to have lasted for a little over a year. And so instead of what uniformitarianism and all of science contend, the flood, um, well, instead of what they say, which is that over a long ass period of time, these layers were laid down by different geologic events, and all these layers were rapidly laid down, uh, and this isn't taken seriously in the scientific community. I don't even know if I have to say that already because it is the Genesis flood, but it's not. And the issue is that there are several different ways to show that. Some of them are technical, and some of them are too common sense to really have an impact when you're arguing with younger creationists. Like, you can't say, how come no one's taking you seriously to these guys? And you can't say it to these guys in front of an audience that is more amiable to younger creationist arguments. But if you start going into radiometric dating and carbon and atoms and decay and zycrons, or not zycron, zircon, all that stuff, people will either zone out, and creationists will point to the fact that the nature of radiometric decay is that you have to have a statistical analysis to analyze the dates you get, because you'll get a range of dates. You won't just get one single date. If you use radiometric dating, you'll get several different dates, and sometimes samples where you get the dates can be contaminated and they can get weird numbers. The other thing with radiometric dating is that if you date things that happen in historic time, like for example, if you date things that happen in historic time with carbon dating or potassium argon or uranium dating, the uranium series, you're going to get crazy numbers because those different radiometric dating, those different elements measure specific time frames. They're more accurate within specific time frames. For all of them, for just to demonstrate my point, let's say a time frame for a specific element is 20,000 to 20 million years. If you measure something that we can relatively date to between 20,000 to 20 million years, you're going to get a more accurate date. But if you measure something that was earlier, more contemporaneous with our time today, that is anything like 19,000 to today, with this measuring, with this specific radiometric element, you're going to get a weird date. You're going to get crazy numbers. And we know why that is. It's because you have to measure things knowing that you're measuring in the right time range. But this is kind of, it's not easy to explain to people. And when people see, oh wow, this gives a lot of crazy dates when you date something, why do people trust this dating system? that's a lot easier to say to an audience, and people like Kent Hovind get away with that. And that's why I like radiometric dating. I rely on it, and I think it's more than well supported. When I'm arguing about this stuff, I think it's hard to get. I haven't really developed a good way of expressing it in a more concrete fashion to sound persuasive. So then and like I said, when you start talking about half-life, decay, metrics, all that stuff, people like, so I don't, yeah. But the thing is that when you talk about relative dating, just the term relative always throws people off, especially when you're talking about things that relate to religion. So relative dating, it's strata. The law of supposition is all things being equal, when layers of strata are laid down, the ones on the bottom are older than the ones on the top. That, I mean, like I said, it's all things being equal, but it's definitely a good starting place. And again, geologists are aware that there are exceptions, and they look for these exceptions before they say, okay, by the laws, superposition, this layer represents this geologic time. Now, the whole thing is that modern geology says that all the strata layers were laid down at different geologic time. But the thing is that there are phenomenons that occur today that can lay out several layers of different materials. Like you get a lot of mud layers, sediment layers from wave action and underwater currents and stuff, and river fans. You get a lot of that. And so that's another problem, because another example is creationists will point to catastrophic events like the Mount St. Helens volcanic eruption in 1980, which laid out a lot of sediments. But the thing is that that's a catastrophic event that laid out a lot of sediments. That's a lot different than the geologic phenomenon that laid out a lot of other sediments. But when people see, well, how can you tell the difference? What do you know? Again, it gets kind of complicated. So I stick with this one argument. Well, I still argue the stuff, but this one argument I really feel is persuasive. And even actually like going into the more technical articles on creation, Institute for Creation Research, Answers in Genesis, and other sites, I haven't seen this addressed. I've seen parts of this topic addressed on sites like that, but not the whole argument. So this argument looks at ancient inland seas. In the past, Pangea and made everything all a clump, and due to plate tectonics and time, we've all spread out. But while that happened, the world was covered with a lot more inland seas. In fact, oh gosh, I don't know exactly, but a long time ago, a lot more of the land was covered in water. This in itself contradicts the assumption of young Earth creationism, which is that there were more shallow oceans, and there was more flat, normal, I think it was flat. There was more pretty serene land and oceans. And there also was no rain, and there also was no wind before the flood occurred. That's what it was like. There's also more oxygen. I'm not sure how that was calculated, but that's a big thing in the flood account. Anyways, there were many inland seas as demonstrated by the geologic column. And these inland seas are all around. I'm going to be talking a lot about ones that are in North America, but there's ones in Egypt and in Eurasia. A major inland sea is I've only read it, so I might be saying it wrong. It's the Tethys Ocean. It's spelled Tethys. That was a big inland sea. Now, the thing is, you can tell these inland seas that there were inland seas by understanding that when shorelines change, they grow and become smaller. You see that you can look at different deposits because the sea is salty, right? You have salt in the sea. And what happens is that the salt evaporates as the seas dwindle, and salt accumulates, evaporates, accumulate. Now, the other thing that you can identify a sea today, obviously, is there's coral reefs. You have coral reefs, especially at the boundaries, the continental ridges. But coral reefs would also form around volcanoes, on top of extinct volcanoes, and so forth. Today we see coral reefs, and coral itself, just talking about coral, is an argument against young Earth creationism. Similar to dendrochronology, where you count the rings of a tree, you can count the rings of certain coral in order to attempt to measure time. Younger creationists have several arguments countering that method of relative dating, or that method of dating. And the issue is, when you bring up the topic that I'm bringing up and you mention coral, that's where younger creationist heads go. They think that you're going to talk about coral growth rates and assume that coral grows today the same way it grew back then. That's the argument, at least. And so younger creationists, what they'll say is, well, the antediluvian age before the flood, the seas were a lot richer in nutrients, and so it's plausible that coral grew at a faster rate back then. And the fossilized coral, which is what I'm going to be focusing on, the fossilized coral that we see in the fossil record, that is maintained to have be coral from before the flood. And again, it's asserted that the rates that coral grows today cannot be compared to ancient coral in the fossil record. But incidentally, creationists have come up with rough metrics, rough dating of coral. Morris and Whitcomb in 1961, and their famous young Earth creationists, they calculated that coral will grow 20 centimeters every 5 years. And so that's roughly 4 meters a year. So if you look at a coral reef and you see that it's 4 meters, like vertically, it's all right to assume that coral has been growing for a year. Now, we have we have Great Barrier Reefs that young Earth creationists assert started growing after the flood event because they're obviously very old. So there are coral reefs that are thousands of years old, like the Great Barrier Reef, for example. They accept that. They don't accept that it's older than obviously the flood event, but they accept that it's fairly old. So they have to say it's at least, oh, what is it? It's at least 3,000 years old after the flood event, pretty much. So we know, so the creationists gave us a rough estimate to age coral, and we know that corals are associated with the sea. Not only are they associated with the sea, corals are associated with shallow edges of land masses because coral, they need to photosynthesize, so they need to be closer to the water's surface. They're also associated with certain temperatures. You can coral will only grow in a tropical temperature range, at least the type of coral that's on continental ridges. There's other types of coral is flatter and it grows deeper in the water. And there's even coral, I believe, that can survive in colder waters. But basically today, coral, it's more shallow because it needs to say, hey, sun, give me some photosynthesis. The photosynthesis, it grows at a rate that creationists say is about 4 meters a year. And oh, what else? They're associated with oceans. Now, bringing that back to the inland seas that I mentioned a little bit ago, there are places in the geologic record that indicate that there are inland seas because we find fossilized coral. We find large chunks, like several meters, way more than 4 meters of fossilized coral in areas all around the world that are also, through other means, seen to have been places where there are inland seas. Now, the thing is that the flood event is supposed to be responsible for all of the sedimentary layers. So in places like central Michigan, for example, if you go down a little more than half a kilometer, you will find coral reefs, fossilized coral reefs, several meters of fossilized coral reefs there. Now, if coral grows 4 meters a year, and in the middle of the geologic column, we have several meters of coral, like orders of magnitude more than the ones. Like we have like 20, well, yeah, there's several meters of coral there. And that indicates right off the bat that, well, actually, in the middle of the flood event, when all these layers are being laid down rapidly, all of a sudden there's a place where coral reefs can grow, like a rough ring going into, I think it's Lake Michigan, one of the Finger Lakes, and circling Michigan has been like identified. Now, there are several arguments against this from the creationists, but it doesn't consider the Achilles heel, which is that this, especially in Michigan, but also at several other sites of inland seas, there are salt domes. Now, the reason why this is important is because oftentimes fossil coral is dismissed as being just patches of it that broke off and got crumbled up and then happened to get laid down in the sedimentary layers, and it's only happenstance that it seems to also correlate with what we might think an inland sea might look like. It's just because of the flood. But when you also have salt domes associated with fossil coral, that destroys that argument, and it ultimately falsifies the Genesis flood account. And the reason why that is because salt is water soluble. If it was like a intense water action laying down these sedimentary layers, that salt would not be there. That salt, it would have dissolved. It would have dissolved with the water as things were being laid down. It would have been with all its other salty buddies around in the ocean. It would have been dissolved. So in the middle of the geologic column is a whole bunch of salt that shouldn't be there. Now, another thing that creationists will say is that salt plumes occur all the time. Salt plumes, due to underground volcanic action, arise. They go through the path of least resistant. And if you look at a cross section, the geologic column, you'll see like layer, 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 but then you'll see like a plume. It looks kind of like a balloon going up through it of salt, and that occurs. And so a lot of times these salt domes are said to just be salt plumes, which is just another process that happens underground. But the thing is, you can't say that if there are also coral reefs ringing or obviously growing on these salt domes, because the salt plumes that occur because of volcanic action, which means that these salt plumes are associated with high temperatures. So when these salt plumes develop, there's a lot of heat, and that heat would destroy, it would disintegrate all of these coral reef, all of these fossilized coral reefs. So not only is it more likely that this was just the site of an ancient sea because of the coral also shows that it can't be a salt plume, because that coral wouldn't be there due to the volcanic action having disintegrated it, if it was volcanic action that's responsible for the salt. This is especially the case in central Michigan, like I mentioned before. So that salt shouldn't be there because salt is water soluble. It would have dissolved in the floodwaters. And the thing with the, oh, I feel bad. I should have remembered. I don't remember. I think it was the Silurian, which is roughly like, yeah, between 450 and 415 million years ago, during the Silurian. That's the date of the inland sea associated with the central Michigan salt domes. But There are also inland seas identified by the existence of meters of salt and meters of coral reefs found in other stratigraphic layers associated with other geologic time frames. The Pleistocene, there's also the Ordovician, there's the Cretaceous and the Jurassic. And these are all over the world. So we have places, several areas in the geologic column with salt that should have disappeared with the flood, and with coral that should have either been destroyed by the flood or should have been destroyed by the volcanic action that would have made salt plumes. This falsifies the flood account. It's intense. It's getting hot. This falsifies it. Yeah, it's that simple. This salt should not be there, but it is. This salt shouldn't be in several different layers all around the world. Now, one of the very last things that creationists might pick on is, well, what's up with this? What's up with these coral? I mean, is it just like little tiny crumples of coral? And like I said, there's whole meters of coral found in these places where we're pretty sure that ancient inland seas were. But also, the coral are in fans. There's fan coral found, and the fan coral are intact. Like you'll see several, fossils that are impressions, like casts and molds of several coral fans together, and they don't look like they were broken up. They were a part of a ridiculous flood event that should have broken it up. John Morris, son of Henry Morris, wrote an article about coral, and this is what you'll see in creationist articles about ancient coral. They don't talk about the salt, and that's a major, I'm just flabbergasted by this. And I'm flabbergasted that this isn't always mentioned, why this isn't, people understand that if you take a spoonful of salt, you put it in water, stir it up, it's going to dissolve. It's not going to clump down at the bottom. People know that salt is water soluble. Even the recent influx of flat earthers won't deny that. And once you say, look, there's this salt and it's associated with coral in a layer in the middle of the geologic column, it's a lot easier than talking about radiometric dating. It's a lot easier than talking about half-life and carbon-14 versus carbon-13 versus atmosphere, carbon versus carbon that's been contaminated. This stuff shouldn't be there. And modern science has an explanation for it. They look at the coral reefs and they look at how things form today, and they look at other associated fossils. There's two more things I want to mention that are associated with the fossils and with the salt that's found in these areas. With the fossils, it's not just ancient coral, it's other microfossils. If for whatever reason people argue that this ancient coral might survive salt plumes, the volcanic action that caused these salt plumes, smaller microfossils associated, microfossils that are fossils of creatures that were clearly marine in nature, they clearly lived underwater, those should have been disintegrated, but they're also found in these salt domes with the associated coral. Now, the other thing that we're seeing is that it's not just table salt. These salt domes are made up of salts that are associated with the salty with the evaporites of inland seas today. I think halcite is another impure type of salt that's associated with this. We look at the inland seas today, like Salt Lake City and the Caspian Sea and the Red Sea and the Black Sea and other places, and we look at the evaporites associated with those. For example, I think it's the Black Sea that's becoming an issue because it's shrinking, and you can see evaporites that are the result of the shrinking of the Black Sea. And they're made up of impure salt types and those impure salt types are found in these salt domes with these coral reefs in the middle of the stratigraphy that should have been laid down in less than a year. In less than a year, I think I can actually get away with saying. I want to say in 40 days, but I recently saw a timeline that said that there was still a lot of action happening. Regardless, we have meters of coral reef, and remember, they grow 4 meters a year, according to creationist sources. We have them at several points in the geologic column, spread out all over the world with salt domes. It's water soluble. You can't account for this with the Noachian flood model. You can't account for these major discrepancies in the geologic column. You can't reconcile them with the idea that all of the sedimentary layers for 1,800 meters were all, for more than 1,800 meters, all the way down to the Cambrian layers. You can't, it's all, sorry, it's falsified. Now, it seems too easy. There's 2 things that bug me about it. It seems too easy, actually, because people understand salt water is soluble. It just seems too easy. And I've only heard it used as an argument in a debate once, when Kent Hovind, this is how I heard of it originally, when Kent Hovind did pretty much I take all the calls of the infidel guy. He went on the infidel guy show and took calls. It was a great show. One guy called in and Kent Hovind got away with it because the guy wouldn't stop talking. He got away with not answering the guy because the guy wouldn't stop talking, and it seemed like Reggie, the host, he didn't think it was that interesting. The issue is that geology isn't interesting to a lot of people. It's because of arguing against younger creationists that I became interested in geology. That I actually ended up getting a geology minor. And also because I didn't want to grow up and I wanted to stay in college forever. So getting a minor would have necessitated that. But don't worry about that. Now, that's the only time I've heard of it. I've seen it written about in other arguments against younger creationism, against the flood. But this should be the first thing mentioned. Right away, it should be the first thing mentioned. Because creationists aren't going to deny that salt is water soluble. I mean, I would, if someone was like, I don't know, I would like get a drink. I would go get salt, and I wish I actually did have it ready. What is it? Salt. This is what I would do. I'd make him watch, like I'm Bill Nye the Science Guy. I would go, all right, you see salt right here. Rip it, pour it in thing, stir it, and go, where's checkmate creationist? I mean, I don't understand why it's not brought up, which makes me, it made me concerned that there was actually a plausible answer for it, and Kent Hovind just didn't know it at the time. The show is over a decade was that show actually aired. So I don't know. But the thing is, I've been looking at creationist articles on the issue. I've been reading them. Like I've mentioned one by Morris, and there's one by a guy named Thomas. Thomas wrote, that's his last name. He wrote for Answers in Genesis, and Morris, John Morris, is the son of Henry Morris. He's a geologist, and both of those guys don't mention the salt domes that are associated with these coral. I think it's mentioned in an article by Snelling, but I only downloaded that recently. I'll go through it, but I don't think it's, I mean, I did a brief search, and I don't think it's, I think he might actually explain, he might just be explaining salt plumes, and salt plumes are different from salt domes. I hope I've implicitly made that clear, but now I'm explicitly making it clear. But I haven't seen a response to this from creationists. And so I'm afraid that, like, I'll bring it up and then there's a clear reason why it's defeated, but it doesn't seem, I mean, it might be because people think, okay, that's one thing. You need more things to falsify a model. I mean, they probably expect me to say that about evolution. So they might think, well, I can get away with that. And I've heard people like Hovind say, like when people showed him that the nylon eating bacteria, and he said, it's just a little change. You're talking about bacteria for crying out loud. Like, I'm afraid that that's going to happen. It's going to be dismissed. When I brought this up with a creationist on Google Hangout, he kind of did that. But the thing is, this is not, it's not just an isolated case. This is around the world. These are large pieces of coral associated with these salt domes, and these coral are clearly not laid out from a catastrophic event like the Noachian flood is described as. John Morris said, I mean, this is what he said, I want to read it. It's likely that the huge variety of splintered fossil reef material could have accumulated as the strata were laid down during the flood, roughly resembling actual reefs. So he's saying that coral reefs were broken up, messed up, splintered apart during the flood, but then laid out in the rough shape of what coral reefs resemble today, in the rough shape of, you know, like an atoll growing around a extant volcanic opening, or on continental ridges. Yeah, I mean, just that is the example of ad hoc. That is ridiculous. To say, I mean, you know, I mean, this guy has like a PhD in geology too, John Morris. He has a PhD, but my glasses are getting foggy over the incredulity. Over just the, I mean, these people won't accept several different fields collating to the same conclusion of evolution, but I mean, they say, you know, you can't make a plane. A tornado can't take all the parts of a plane and can't take scrap metal and make it into like a Boeing 747. But apparently, a flood can destroy like vast coral reefs and turn them into insignificant splinters of what they used to be, but then lay them out as in the exact same like distribution. That's perfectly reasonable. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I don't know if I should continue because there's another recent argument. But, well, what I like about this coral reef thing, besides the obvious things, is that I've actually looked into it, and I felt very lucky to actually find a rough calculation for the growth rate of coral by creationists. And so the other argument that I've been interested in, I recently found a similar metric given by creationists. And so I think that I should actually try and figure that out and make my objection to the young age of the earth more rigorous using creationist sources in the way that I feel I've done with the ancient inland seas argument that I've given here. So I won't give that now. But I should end. This isn't the only thing that falsifies the flood. This isn't the only thing that falsifies 6,000 years for the age of the earth. But this is one of the more commonsensical, straightforward arguments that I don't know how a creationist can weasel out of it. And so I've been sitting on it for a while, and I've decided to make a video of it. I was hoping people would come in, but I'm not known or anything. I don't do anything. So I'm not surprised. A little bummed that no one's watching. I'm so alone right now. But there it is. Yeah, I'm going to go and do something, and then I'll come back and I'll stop. But I'm only going to do that in the hopes that someone miraculously comes in and goes, Joe, I want to argue with you about young Earth creationism. Oh my God. It's such a bummer because I usually hang out in Nadia's room, but the people, they don't like talking about evolution anymore. And the only younger creationist who goes into that room who will argue with me is Nephilim Free. And he talks and talks and he's not a very cordial man. So people don't like it, and instead people like arguing about whether or not Stalin was an atheist or whether or not the Inquisition was really crappy. And it's like, what are you gonna do? Well, If anyone ends up watching this, thanks for watching.